Kathy Lopes. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me today on my passion project, Panic and Patience. Essentially, what this podcast really is for people like you. I see you as a leader. I see you as a community builder. I see you as somebody who wants to make a world a better place than how you found it. And Panic and Patience is really this idea that many of us who are trying to impact the world in a positive way dance on this line of one being the sense of urgency that things need to change, things need to happen, policies need to be changed, but also understanding that anything of significance takes time, and that there's power and resilience in understanding that some of the things that we're working for today, we may not even see it come to fruition, and maybe for the next generation, but there's power in that. And so I really just wanted to create this platform for folks like yourself to really express the work that they're doing, so that those who don't know you or are not aware of your work can find ways to support what you're doing. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So what I like to do in the beginning of the podcast is really as an icebreaker. I just want you to just tell me a story. It could be about anything, but I'm curious to hear what you got for me today.
Okay. So I actually, preparing for this, was wondering, or was really trying to figure out, like, what do I want to talk about? Because there's so many different directions this conversation can go for me, just the work that I've done. But I thought of this one story that I think just gives, sets off where I come from and what always grounds me in the work that I do. And a lot of the work that I do around equity and diversity in education comes from my own personal story of education. So I grew up, so I'm the child of immigrants. I'm first generation American. My parents immigrated here from the Cape Verde Islands. And I grew up in a small suburban town in Massachusetts, predominantly white. So my entire educational system has been within predominantly white educational institutions. So in high school, I was one of the only students of color. And I was in 10th grade in biology. And I remember having a back and forth with another student, a white male student. And, you know, we were going in on each other, and then he snapped and said, just go back to Africa. And being at that point in my life, you know, you're told, like, school, you're supposed to be protected. There are adults that you go to when you need support, when you need help. And I internalized that. That's all I knew. So I turned to the teacher, because I was so caught off guard, and said, you know, this student just told me to go back to Africa, because I was so caught off by him saying that. Mm-hmm. And the teacher in that moment, rather than, you know, interact in a way that I had expected him to interact, just said, can you get back to work and stop disrupting the class? And what that did for me was really begin my understanding that the educational system wasn't built for people who look like me, wasn't built for people who had my background and my story, because I thought I was supposed to be protected like every other student. I thought I was supposed to be valued like every other student. And his inability to engage or to hold him accountable or to even ask, you know, how did that make me feel? Was I okay? Was I safe? Just really set this idea of, wow, I'm really isolated here in this particular environment. And as I tell that story, I do a lot of DEI work, I do a lot of facilitation, and I share that story, and you get this reaction like, oh my God, I can't believe he did that. Mm-hmm. And I've come to a place where I see it as less than, you know, he didn't care, but he didn't know what to do. He wasn't equipped to interrupt that conversation. He wasn't trained. He wasn't brought up in a system that told him he was supposed to value me in the same way that he was valuing these other students that looked like him. So that's where a lot of my vision around the system and mm-hmm. the underneath of our education system is where I saw my role in really unearthing the systems that reinforce these ideas, that reinforce folks, the oversight of children of color in education, the lack of interrupting racist behaviors and unconsciously reinforcing a lot of the racist behaviors that I think we've all experienced in our education system. So mm-hmm. I thought that was a good place to set this conversation up.
It's an interesting story because I wonder, now, because of the work that you've done, like how do you look at it from a accountability standpoint? Like, you know, because you mentioned like he wasn't equipped, and so where do you draw the line between not being equipped to maybe being racist, or just not being held accountable so that you can learn these anti-racist ideas or these anti-racist ways and ways to handle situations just like that?
Well, I think we have to be very clear that regardless of if you intended to or not, we have to create systems that protect all children. So even if he was racist, there needs to be a system in place where he can't be allowed to get away with that. And then if he actually is someone who wanted to interrupt and protect me, then we have to create a system that supports him in doing that. So accountability is really important. I work with a lot of students in education who, when something happens to them, quickly say, I want this student suspended, I want this teacher fired, and all of that is good and well. But if we're not really creating a system that interrupts that behavior, then we're just removing someone and replacing someone without, again, the ability to do the work that we're asking them to do. So I think we have to be like unequivocal that we're not going to tolerate it, and there has to be accountability. There has to be conversations. Yeah, I'm a big proponent for restorative justice because I think that actually allows people to see the damage and the pain they're causing rather than just a black and white reprimand where there may not be learning or restorative measures. But I think all educational institutions, or any institution that we work in, we live in, there has to be a clear standard that there's no tolerance for this behavior. But in addition to that, we have to figure out how to shift the narrative that we're just not punishing people without there being a restorative process or a learning opportunity.
And I want to dig a little deep into like how you came into this work. Because, you know, experiences like that, I'm sure in your work today, you are triggered by, you know, some childhood memories and experiences that push you even further to want to continue to do this work. And so I'm interested in how you had that experience in high school, and now you express that you're now in DEI work. And it feels like that's not a mistake. That didn't happen by accident. And so could you help me understand like what caused you to really embark in that journey and choose that as a career path, or DEI work as a career path?
So I'm a social worker by training, and I really was led to social work because I continued to, as I became educated, be drawn to understanding the ways that communities are segregated, the ways that resources are allocated to certain groups. And I just innately connected to this understanding of growing up around predominantly white children and families who had access to all these resources, and I did as well. But because of some of the barriers of my parents, English not being their first language, or some of the cultural ways that I showed up in my community, I recognized that I was still at a disadvantage. So I was really drawn to this idea of social work and breaking down and understanding all the ways our society really supports certain groups and really marginalizes certain groups. And then as I continued to become educated, realized that this was all intentional and all designed. So once I found that path, any agency I was working in as a social worker, I was a therapist, or I was in education, or I was in nonprofit organizations, I was always the voice for equity. I was always the voice for these are racist practices. This makes our clients uncomfortable. This makes our families uncomfortable. And you can imagine that voice isn't always welcomed in organizations. Right. But I continue to find that fire in me to say, this is unacceptable, and I have some education and access, and I can maneuver into these spaces where I'm going to push. That's what my calling is. So here I am 20 years later, intentionally in a DEI role, again, connected to education, where I bring all of that. I bring my social work lens, I bring my personal experience every day in the work that I do, and I bring, my policy information and my advocacy skills. So I incorporate all of that, but I really do believe that this is where I'm intended to be in my journey.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're dealing a lot with policy and systems in your day-to-day work. And so how have you built community in the work that you're doing? Is it more so building community from the network that you're creating in this work, or are you doing it in other ways?
So I think it's both. I think because of my background, I've been able to connect with different groups and different organizations and different communities and different cities. So I think that's just been a part of my journey where I have networking opportunities and I have access to people in different that are positioned in places. But I also think this idea of community, and I thought about this a little bit too, because I've been watching some of your podcasts and thinking about community. And I think inherently this is what Black folks been doing, right? Like we are a people of community. We always come together, whether it's to celebrate or to mourn or to care for each other. So I think during this time right now that we find ourselves in this pandemic, in this place of isolation, we have, easily been able to be like, oh, I'm calling on my community to do this. I'm reaching out for love, support, for collectivism, for collaboration. And I have seen that flourish in the last 3 to 4 months. I have seen our people show up and show out, whether it's our healers doing healing work. We have people of color now investing in yoga and meditation and breath work and music and art in ways that we haven't, because we haven't been given the space, we haven't been given the time, we haven't been given the intention. And all of this is inherently ours, right? When we think about our indigenous practices, we think about our healing work, we think about our therapeutic measures, these are all ours and it's been culturally appropriated. And now we're taking it back. So all of our healers are showing up to take care of us. And then we are now stepping up because our passion is exploding, right? This idea of panic and patience, this has been urgent to us for forever. So now we're like, okay, we're going to bring what we have to the table. So you're seeing our representatives show up in our legal alleys, and our educators really showing up. We're seeing creatives like yourself and artists coming out to say, this is the way I'm going to show up. We're seeing, like Liz Miranda step up, and Ayanna Presley and Rachel Rollins, and all of our people, our community is really showing up in ways that we know that we bring something to the table. So I think that twofold. It's part of like we're loving each other and taking care of ourselves as we already do. We just have more time for it, and then we're bringing the skills and the strengths and the beauty of what we've been working on to the table, to the forefront too.
Yeah, I think I agree with you 100%, because I do think that there's a deeper level of creativity, not so much in actual creativity in the sense that you're creating, but this exploration and discovery of things that have now become outlets that weren't outlets before. And I think because we have to sit, because we can't go out and do things, as normal, we have to find a new normal. And in that new normal, we're able to discover or engage in conversations that we wouldn't have, like, whether it be acknowledging mental health things and trying to sit down and create spaces where folks can meditate and like breathe. I'm not sure that would even be a conversation if you didn't have the time to sit down and actually receive that. It's just like, no, I got to go to work, or I got a class, or I got to do this. There's always something that you got to do. And I'm wondering for a lot of those who are trying to make change, has this been because a lot of us will say this has been a moment that is so heavy and we're carrying so much. But then on the other end, it's just like, I have grown so much in ways that I never even imagined. And this has actually been a benefit to me, because this is going to equip me to continue to do this work. Because I wasn't privy to meditation. I never paid attention to it. So what do you think about that from a mental health healing aspect, regardless of how that manifests, from a creative standpoint, from a meditation standpoint? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think even for myself, I have found meditation through COVID and isolation. I have refound yoga, which was a part of my practice years ago. And yoga for many is really expensive. It's not sustainable for a lot of folks. And I have rediscovered yoga through, Zoom. I have just been spending time with my community and just practicing ways to heal and love each other and celebrate that we have to be creative in our celebrations now. So I think that the time has really like brought us into a tighter knit community, because the community was there. It's just really brought us together. I think that there are two different experiences happening simultaneously. So I think for folks like us, you know, we're passionate, but this has been brewing up inside of us, right? This is not new. What happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we're aware of this. We've been angry, we've been advocating, but the level to which this has risen, we're now ready. We're ready to say, all right, time's up. I'm in a position where I have access, I have resources, I have education, I have community, so I'm going in. Simultaneously, though, we have this whole community now that's just been awakened, right? And it's hard for us, because I think some of the trigger that I'm having, even as I do this work, and I work with predominantly white communities or white educators who want to do better, but this awakening that they are having it's triggering, because how did you miss it? How have you missed this? And it's because you intentionally were not paying attention. You were intentionally trying to preserve your health and mental health by avoiding and ignoring what was happening. And again, there were systems that allowed them to do this. So there's a part of, we want to support, right? We want to embrace, because this is a collective movement, but it's also like, I can't take on your awakening right now, because I'm already on level 5 of my awakening, and my people are doing it here. So go get yourselves together, do the work you need to do, and come on, you can come, but don't drag me down while you're still in the process. And I think that's a hard place to be, because you don't want to dismiss what's happening, and you want to invite it, but I don't want to do extra work.
Right.
My work here. So that's a balance that I think many of us are struggling with. Like, we appreciate it, but it's triggering and it's tiring to do their work as well.
I feel that. Oh man, there's so much I want to ask you. You mentioned earlier cultural appropriation and the work that you're doing with DEI. And one of the things that I'm always curious to know, particularly with your background in human services, this aspect of inclusion. And so you have cultural appropriation on one aspect, and then you have this aspect of inclusion. And then there's this phrase that the US or America talks about of being a melting pot. And I find it really difficult to wrap my mind around what that actually means, because when you're doing the work, or trying to do the work, like the work that you're doing in terms of, you know, white folks trying to be better, they tend to take a training or take a, you know, being educated in this space and flipping it in a way that doesn't feel authentic, and it leans more on the cultural appropriation aspect. Absolutely. And so I asked you that because where's the line drawn where the melting pot? Because for you, based upon your experience that you told me earlier, there wasn't such a thing. You had to assimilate to this European ideal, or this space where you had to assimilate to them. So there's really no melting pot, right? But then on the other end, we talk about us as a community helping each other, loving on each other, you know, finding different ways to express ourselves, whether that be meditation, whether that be creating and art and all these different things. And so it's kind of like we have our tribe and our community, and then and then we have to fit into these systems. We have to fit into these other spaces that don't really want us. So what's your thoughts on this, the notion of a melting pot? Is that a thing, or can that be a thing? And does that impact the work that you do? Is that a conversation that's actually being had?
Absolutely. And I think particularly right now, when we talk about white supremacy culture, when we talk about anti-racism, I see the Kendi book over there that really talks about this notion that Americans, right, we've been taught to believe or force ourselves to be colorblind, or want a melting pot, or force assimilation. But with all of these, with the underlying value that to be a part of this country means to be as close to white as possible, right? So melting pot for us is not something that we want to be. We want to be celebrated for our individualism. And one thing about the Black community, our Black culture, right? Like, we have our values that many of us are aligned to, but we show up, you know, as we are. So you show up with your tats. I show up, with my style. Someone else is going to show up, with their look and their approach to this work. And we celebrate that. In our community, we're not telling everyone this is one way to do it. We're saying show up as you are, bring what you got, and we're going to love it and we're going to embrace it. And so this idea of a melting pot really is washing down that individualism. And I don't want a melting pot. We don't want a melting pot. We just want equity. We want everyone to be able to show up in the way they show up and still get the same access to education, to net worth, to opportunity, to, financing, to having a safe life and raising your children with the same, assets and resources other children are. But we want to be celebrated, acknowledged, doing it in our own way, right? So there's this, it's really deconstructing everything we've been taught. And a lot of this has been unlearning for myself, because growing up the way I did, I wanted to be as white as the other students. I wanted to assimilate. I wanted to leave my culture behind because I was only told this is the way to succeed. This is the way to be celebrated. And it took so much unlearning to re-love, what my parents brought and who I am and where I come from, and figure out how to show up in these spaces as me, but still be savvy enough to know, okay, this is the only way I'm going to get through that door or have a voice at the table. So I think the work I'm on is I can get in the door, I can get at the table, but are you going to value my voice? Can I bring other people there to sit at the table? And can we tear down these systems that make it more advantageous for white men to always have access to power? So, that's where the anti-racism work comes in. Like, let's tear down what we value as, successful or intelligent or, polished, because these are all like white Eurocentric ways of thinking. And there are different ways that we can show up with beauty and intelligence. And how do we deconstruct that? All of that can be in a room, and it's not threatening to people.
Right. I don't lose my light by sharing my candle with you. We can lift each other and we can both shine. So resources is a big thing when trying to make any sort of impact. And now you're director in DEI for a well-resourced, school district. How do you not only help those white folks who want to do better, but also understand that the real work is done in the areas that don't have those resources? Like, how do you find balance in that? Because some may see it's just like, oh yeah, well, it's easy for her to go and do these programs and start these programs because she got the funding and she got the support because these white folks are trying to figure it out. On the other end, these Black and brown kids in these, under-resourced school districts, they don't have a Kathy Lopes that is rooting for them. They don't have a Kathy Lopes who is fighting for, their well-being and things that are helping those families. So how do you find a balance in that? How do you find the harmony in trying to serve both communities? Because they're both important.
They are both important. And I think that it really depends on kind of what your trajectory is and where your skill set is. So I think that part of what I bring to the table, again, I talked about being a social worker. I'm trained in being a social worker. So everything I do is rooted in relationships. Everything I do is rooted in assessment and self-awareness and really getting an understanding of what's in the way, what are the needs, right? Like, this is just how my brain is programmed. So when I go into these spaces, I first and foremost am building relationships. One, because I don't look like them, right? So they don't trust me. So I got to build these relationships so I can get trust, and then I can get them to invest and be vulnerable in the work. In other spaces too, even if I'm Black, I'm showing up in a different way. And I got to build trust with my Black community, kind of like, I don't know. You're coming here, you're working in this particular community. How do I know you're about what I'm about, right? So I have to build trust there. So for me, going into a community that is well-resourced is where I feel like I can get a lot of work done because I can get the resource. Like, they won't have the resource to even create this position, right? To put it in their budget, where a lot of schools don't. And then be able to put funding aside for training, for PD opportunities, to bring speakers, to get folks, learning about restorative justice. And that is necessary. And in other communities, it's not that they don't have a Kathy Lopes or someone who's even more impassioned or can do this differently, like in BPS. But then if you don't have the resources, you're hiring people and you're burning people out because their ideas are not built going out to fruition, right? They're not actually able to implement and bring in what this work entails. So you need investment and you need trust, but then you actually need leadership or the financial resources to say, we care about this, we're committed to this, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And that is, we're still in a space where some folks are getting it and some people just want to check off the box. So for me, going somewhere that might have been, you know, a little further out from kind of where I live and what I consider home, I also found that there is so much opportunity there to move, to get the work moving, because the leadership is invested, the community's invested, and it's well resourced enough to actually implement my vision.
I love that. And another thing that seems to be buzzing around in our whether it be on social media or headlines, is this notion, and I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this, is this notion of protecting our sisters, protecting our Black women. And from what I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, human services as an industry is dominated by women, right? And so you being a Black woman, and I'm asking this so that I could be better, how does men, particularly Black and brown men, support women? Not so much support them as like a partner or a spouse, but just a sister that's doing this work. How do we as men protect and support the efforts that you are doing, whether it's behind the scenes or on the front lines, to help push this thing along? Because I feel like there's this call to action for men to help our sisters. And I don't know if it's that we don't want to, or we don't know how, or we didn't even know you guys needed it, whatever the case may be. I'm asking the question now so that I could be better, and then hopefully my audience who are seeing this can be like, oh, okay, I know I can do that. You know, I may not be able to do this big thing, but these small things I can do to help out my sister who's doing this work, because my kid is in those schools. You know, my kid is in those programs. So I have a vested interest in the work that you're doing, regardless if I know you or not. But if I see somebody who looks like me, but is a female and is doing this work, I need to support in some way. What would you say I could do to help what you're doing?
So, I mean, I think trust Black women, right? Black women have been leading revolution since the beginning of time. It's just that the faces of revolution have been male. It's been male dominated. But if you go into any history, you will find Black women who are doing the work, doing the organizing, writing the speeches, showing up, building community. So this is not new for us. And I think what happens is, and I think I heard Sharice Perry also talking about it, you know, we find ourselves in these positions, and we find ourselves as Black women as highly educated and in these positions, but ultimately the power is not held by us, right? So even when I was assistant commissioner, you know, the power is not held, but I'm not reporting ultimately to a Black woman. I'm reporting to a white woman who's Secretary of Health and Human Services. When I've worked at nonprofit organizations, there's a lot of men who are CEOs of these organizations. So we might get the director title or the supervisor title or a commissioner title, but ultimately the buck stops at, for the most part, white men and sometimes white women, and then Black men over Black women, right? So when we talk about equity and diversity and inclusion, where are we creating spaces for Black women to actually be at the helm, right? To be at the top of the decision-making process. Where are the Black female superintendents, right? Superintendents are overly represented by white men and some white women. And so for Black men, my charge is to just support and stand by and speak on our behalf. And when there are spaces that maybe the door has been open for you, take a second and say, is this better equipped though by my sister who I know has been doing this work? I'm going to help them get in the door. I'm going to advocate that the next CEO we bring in, I'm going to push all of my sister friends to apply. And because I now have some leverage, I'm going to get them, you know, at the top of the list, right? So we have to do the work that the white community has been doing around network. And we have to be, for men, it's giving up a sense of power in places where you know there's a better representation of that a Black woman could come in and do it just as well or do it better. So some of that is ego check. Some of that is trusting us. Some of that is when you get in these positions, open the door, you know, the same way I do for my friends and my family. And, you know, family, I think about community is, you know, if I'm in a position, I'm going to tell all my Black brothers and sisters, come in and I might be able to get you a little further along in the process. You just got to do the work and show up. Right. So we have to do that for each other. We have to push ego aside and we have to trust that we actually know what we're doing. I went through a list of women who are out here showing up, like Liz Miranda and Ayanna Pressley and Rachel Rollins. And when they speak, they are not focused on a Black woman agenda. They are focused on the community. Black women care about our entire community. We care about our babies. We care about our men. We care about our parents. We care about our grandparents. So it's really celebrating this culture and saying, I'm going to vote for this Black woman, which I don't even think we're still there as a country, right? The idea of Joe Biden picking a Black woman might turn some people off. When we know Black women do the work, we should be running things. Yeah. So it's really unlearning kind of this way that ego has put us in this battle where we don't think there's room to bring along or to have a Black woman lead because we feel, or people might feel like, well, it means that I'm giving up some sense of power.
So you think you think it's the first step is really to check, as men, check our egos, and then the second is the trust, and because I think for a lot of us, we trust you in our homes, but in positions of power, there's some challenges there. And so I love what you said. And how can parents who seem to be powerless in what their child experiences once they leave their homes, right? Once they're in these schools, whether it's a school that's predominantly Black and brown, whether it's a school that's predominantly white, it's almost like we have to trust that they are getting the things that they need when they're in these classrooms and when they're in these institutions. How can parents who may not be educators, who may not be, you know, in the social work industry or human services industry, how can we help push these things along and support, you know, efforts that you're doing? Because I feel like it's a collective thing that, you know, as a tribe, as a community, we need to come together as a whole to help push these things along. And I feel like a lot of the parents, at least that I've spoken to, we don't necessarily know what to do. We can be outraged about whatever's happening in our house, you know, because if you came home and as my child and talked about the experience you had in that classroom, as a parent, I would be pissed. But that anger doesn't necessarily create change. You know, we can go up to the school and be pissed at the principal or the teacher, but how does that actually change for the next Kathy who's dealing with that, the next, immigrant child who's coming in, you know, they smell different because their parents cook different food, or they have a different outfit because that's the outfit that that's traditional to their culture, right? And so how do we as parents actually help this? Because a lot of us are working, you know, 10, 12 hours a day. You know, we don't have time to go to PTO meetings necessarily. You know, there has to be some ways that folks will be like, oh, well, we'll just come to these meetings, come to the town halls. It's like a lot of parents don't have time for that. So what do we do? What do we do?
Right. And I think part of that is going back to the system isn't set up for people who are working 2 jobs. Or, you know, I work with a lot of MECO communities where the system isn't set up to hold meetings in the communities that these families live in, right? Yeah. So the system, again, is advantageous to the people who already have access. So, I always advise show up. Right? Show up. I do a lot of meetings and there are meetings targeted to communities of color. You don't get a lot of parents. I also recognize why. So then it's my job to then think about how do I make this more accessible? But if you can, show up. Find who the allies are. So I would encourage all parents in the Newton community to find me, build relationships. So when something's going on, you know, you'll trust that I'm speaking on your behalf or I'm working for the same thing that matters to you. And then also find the white allies too, because they do exist. There are people who who are doing really good work and really impassioned about this and really are comfortable with sharing this. But that, again, it's the relationship and the trust of, do I trust my child's teacher to be an ally for me when they constantly are suspending my child, or they want to put them on an IEP, or they're not getting playtime on the football field, and it's not because they're not skilled, it's because the coach has some bias, right? So all of this is happening. So where you, like, think about where to build relationships with people in power, people who have access to shift some of the dynamics. The other thing, in addition to show up when you can and find the relationships, this is where the self-reflection comes in, and think about where your lack of action is actually sustaining systems, right? So this level of apathy, this level of, in order to manage my trauma or to manage my space, I'm not voting, or I'm not even going to look at that. I'm not participating. I'm checked out because either I feel hopeless, or I just don't believe it's actually going to work out in my favor, or, I'm not investing in this. So a lot of those things that we do as a community sustain the systems when we don't show up and vote, not just in November, right? And we saw what happened when our people, our Black men didn't show up and vote, because, Black women, like I said, trust Black women. We showed up and we voted for Hillary. But, showing up in November, but also showing up like locally, your school committee, your district politics, your representatives. And this is stuff that a lot of Black people haven't been really brought to understand, again, because the system has been set up to exclude us. Right. So figure out, where do I have power and where do I have voice? There's a lot happening in our society that really negatively impacts us. And because of apathy or lack of knowledge, we are contributing. So, when the NFL is treating Black players a certain way, and we have a community that says, well, I still want to watch football. When we hear that Chick-fil-A and McDonald's, treats employees a certain way, we're still saying, it's easy. When we hear about Amazon and how it's exploiting their workers, we're like, but Amazon's the best way to get this, right? So there's a level of convenience that we don't want to disrupt for ourselves. And a lot of the work is, the self-reflection is, how am I actually contributing to my people being exploited, to lack of health care for people who look like me, the fact that we're being pushed, children being forced to go into a school system where all science says we're not ready. And well-resourced parents are going to figure out a way around that. Right. Our communities that aren't as resourced are going to just have to accept it. So where do we come together? Where is our community organization? Where are our leaders to say, how do we have a voice in this? Yeah. And if you haven't been voting or you haven't been involved, it's really hard though for people to stand on your behalf when you haven't been participating. So it's show up and start undoing some of the things that we are doing to ourselves.
I love that. I love that. And I think that the other question I have for you, and because I know you've developed a lot of programs in your work, and different things, trainings, and different things that folks can use as templates to help improve their programming. What are some of the things that you're implementing in this new work that you're doing on this new school district that somebody maybe listening could start to think about and maybe apply to their work if they are in a space that has some sort of resources to help push this? Because we're going to be going, or thinking about going back to school in the fall, or maybe later, but there's still these Black and brown babies that need support, whether they have a Kathy Lopes in their organization or institution or not. But some of these parents could also listen to you and be like, well, why don't we have systems or a program like this to at least start, and then and hope that we can improve as we go along? Because I feel like acknowledging that we need something and to have at least something in place to work from is going to be key to helping making things better.
Yeah, and I think there's all different levels to this work, and I really think it goes back to the assessment of what is needed and what's getting in the way. So some baseline stuff, there are trainings out there, particularly with Zoom, that people can hop on and just understand, implicit bias, and understand culturally responsive instruction, understand anti-racist practices, and just really get our minds to start paying attention to what's been designed, and also also trauma-informed ways of thinking and supporting children, getting our Black and brown babies doing meditation, doing breath work, doing yoga, being creative with art at home and music at home, right? So there's a lot of ways that folks like us can tap into that, particularly with the Zoom environment, and a lot of this is free. From the place I sit right now, and it took work to get here, is, you know, I'm thinking about policy, I'm thinking about institutions. So I'm pushing my district to think about how do we get HR involved to look at hiring practices and the white supremacy culture that takes place in our hiring practices. How do we look at teacher evaluations that we are incorporating how culturally responsive instruction and trauma-informed instruction as a part of how teachers are evaluated? And if we're going to evaluate you, then we have to put in resources that you're getting trained and equipped to do this, right? How are we creating more inclusive ways for Black and brown babies and Black and brown parents, and when English isn't your first language, to feel like you can show up to the school and not be an outcast or not feel inadequate? This is something that my parents, I think, struggled with a lot, that, you know, showing up with English not being their first language, or showing up with less education than a lot of the folks in the school, really put them at a disadvantage, because then they feel inadequate to, even though they understand what's happening, even though they're raising their children to value education, they weren't equipped. So my role now is creating those systems that promote inclusion, that promote, you know, equitable practices and hiring and evaluating, that we are creating a system of accountability when students and teachers and staff are saying, I'm experiencing racism, I'm experiencing sexism, I'm experiencing xenophobia. So if we say we care about it, what are we going to do about it? And then actually reinforce this idea of growing and learning, not just punishment. So that's where I'm sitting in, and I know there's a lot of folks doing DEI work that are also doing this. And it also depends, I'm in education, so a lot of people, it's about kind of like storytelling, and what are we doing to really share different stories of Black love and Black community and Black struggle that isn't that same narrative we've been told about violence and inadequacy and drug addiction. But I would just encourage, you know, just regular folks who know what's happening to figure out what's your lane. Maybe your lane is art, maybe your lane is community organizing, maybe your lane is offering free financial resources to a place, or free legal advice to a place. Maybe your lane is hosting, you know, a community book club. Maybe your lane is running for office. And there's not a need to know it all. It's just figure out what do I bring, what am I good at, and how am I going to invest in this? Maybe I'm someone who's going to show up at a protest. Maybe I'm someone who's going to start a petition. And we all bring these skills. We all bring this beauty and creativity. So find your lane and build on that, and get, you know, continue to do this work.
It's that whole notion of if we all do a little, nobody has to do a lot.
Absolutely. And we all bring different skills and strengths. And like, you know, we've talked about this a lot. I'm not a creative person. So I've learned so much about the power of storytelling just through our conversations and how you see stories. And I think, you know, and you know that I'm like a super type A person, right? Which you're not, but also recognizing where that fits into the work too. So the more that we are engaging these conversations and really celebrating what we bring, and also being open-minded to what we don't bring, so we can keep filling the holes, and then that's the community. That's the community building.
That's real. I'm fascinated to know what your thoughts is on this, because you work so closely with systems and policies. What is your thoughts, not so much on the actual mural, because there's a mural in Nubian Square that has Black Lives Matter, and I know, because I know you personally, you're a sports fan as well, and I'm sure you've seen commercials and all these different things where Black Lives Matters and murals and ads and all of these things have been at the forefront of our consciousness in terms of companies and organizations and cities and governments trying to, it in some aspects feels like they're jumping on the bandwagon to sort of put a Band-Aid on the cultural unrest in the race, the races, the divisiveness of race right now in this season. What do you think about what those things actually means, what those symbols actually means, because you are so closely connected to the policies and the systems where you're just like, okay, that's great, but ... What is your but? Because I know there's a but.
Oh, that's a but. I think part of that's the panic, right? The panic we got to do something. And what we can do is, you know, put out a public statement. What we can do is give Juneteenth off, right? So we're seeing all of these organizations feeling like, well, we're in panic now because we don't want to be, you know, outcast as racist.
Yeah.
So, and I think for us, like, that's dope. Like, I want to see the murals. I want to see Juneteenth off. I want to see the celebration. So for us, that's opportunity. Like, good. Put it out there while we can, because I think all of us are worried that it's not going to last, right? Like, this really going to be around in a year.
Yeah.
So we love it. And where there's opportunity to paint Black Lives Matter and Nubian Square and all of that, bring it on. But that still hasn't gotten the murderers of Breonna Taylor in custody, right? We as Black people are still in fear that the murderer of George Floyd might get off, because we're so traumatized. Like, we are not confident that this story is going to play out with justice as it should be sought. So that's where the policy really has to, that's the resources and the policy that an organization or an agency or even a human being is putting into. So I could have friends all day that say, I'm not a racist and I want to be an ally. But if you're not actually giving up a seat at the table that you didn't even deserve, but just get inherently because you're a person of privilege, then you ain't about this life. If you are not teaching your children anti-racist behaviors, not the colorblind approach, not the, oh, they're pretty too, it's, I actually need to teach my child that this way of thinking, we have to unlearn that or stop it from even being learned, right? We're going to remove the Christopher Columbus narrative. We're going to, you know, remove all of these things that have been designed for us to continue to think that America is white, power is white, being normal and standard is white. So that's where the investment is. That is where the dismantling and the disrupting has to happen. And we can celebrate all day and it is beautiful and bring it on and let's take advantage of all of these opportunities. But there's work under that. And if you are only showing up to celebrate, and I'm talking about predominantly white organizations, right? If you're showing up just to say I put out a statement and then you forgot about it, then that isn't work. That's the panic. That's saving yourself. That's protecting yourself. And we need more than protecting. We need people to get uncomfortable. We need people to feel like they're putting things at risk, because we live at risk every day. We don't have that choice. So equity means we're all investing. We're all giving up a sense of privilege to equalize.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess because I know you got to go, but I know that you've been in education for a long time in terms of teaching in higher ed, and you've had mentees. You've been a mentor to a lot of young women, social workers. What advice would you give? Because to the next Kathy Lopes that is in school and had similar experiences, because I would imagine that many of those who go through this or pursue a career like this have been affected in some way by some sort of trauma that has been like, okay, I need to help the next me get through this. And so for particularly Black and brown women who are entering this work, what advice would you give them to enter it, and what should they be aware of in entering this work?
I think what I would have loved to have someone really walk me through when I was early in my career is the power of imposter syndrome. And how we are kind of taught to really second guess the beauty and the gifts and our intellectual capacity that we bring, again, because of the system. And it has been so, it took me about 20 years, 15 years to really feel like, no, I deserve to be here. No, I'm smart enough, and often I'm actually smarter than a lot of the people in the room, and feel comfortable saying that because I could back it up. So even now, as I support folks or young social workers, or when I was working in the graduate school, or I'm a professor, I'm an adjunct professor, but even when I was working in the institution, the level of, or the lack of confidence that Black and brown students are showing up with, and it's designed to have us question, like, do we deserve to be here? And then it puts us off from stepping into space or speaking out or applying for that next position or saying, I could run this, I can build this. So I think dismantling imposter syndrome. When I talk about my education, I was a student who was very capable. I tested well, I performed well, but I never felt good enough being me. And when it got to a place where that felt so triggering, it felt like too traumatic, I started to disengage as a way to create some power. Well, if you don't think I'm smart enough, then I'm going to show up and I'm going to give you exactly what you think about me, right? And that's harming myself. But it was my way of feeling like I was controlling. I'm going to get there before you can do that to me. So again, this unlearning of, you know, I'm not speaking up, but I was going to say exactly what he just said. I was actually going to say it more eloquently. Or, you know, I just started my consulting business and I'm still like, oh my God, am I someone who can run this? And I'm like, I can. So for young folks and the people that I'm supporting and mentoring who keep saying, I'm not ready yet, I need a little bit more of this, I'm like, fuck that. And, you know, you are ready. And because I'm someone who has been mentoring you, someone who is aware of your capacity, I'm telling you, go do it. And I'm not going to lead you astray. I got your back if you really want it. So I think that's the lesson that I want to keep imparting on people who are still growing. And imposter syndrome can last a lifetime, but we have to acknowledge in ourselves that we're just as good, if not better. And then we have to love up on our brothers and sisters and say, like, are you crazy? You better go do that. Like, why are you even questioning it? So
Amen. I love that. Well, it was such a pleasure to talk to you today and to have this conversation. It was really, you know, insightful. I learned a lot from you. I continue to learn a lot from you. I see you. I love you. And thank you for the work that you're doing, because we need you.
Yeah, I see you too. And this is dope what you're doing, this platform you're giving to folks. And I really appreciate being someone that you thought was worthy enough to spit some knowledge. So thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you got up your sleeve next.
Stay tuned.
And continue to shine. All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye.